You believe in Jesus? Yes, I do. Well, you're going to meet him.
And welcome to Steel Creed, where we connect faith and reason to ordinary experience by steel-manning aspects of Christendom. Today, we will be discussing the existence of God. And joining me, as always, my good friend Nate.
Hey Ian, greetings listeners, greetings fellow heretics, looking forward to our discussion today.
All right, well let's get into it. So, the existence of God. So, when last we left our heroes...
Previously on X-Men.
We had talked about the conceptual landscape, and in particular... we had defined what we meant by faith, which was faith. The definition of faith consists of three things. It is something that you accept as true, but for which you cannot posit a test, a fact-based test. And so that's what distinguishes faith from what we refer to as hypotheses, which are things that you assume, but if you really were put to it, you would come up with some tests to go see whether or not it's correct. So it is that which you presume to be true, for which you cannot posit a test, and on which you act. And that is the definition of faith. And as I said in the intro episode that we did, to me, Christendom consists of roughly two statements. That all of Christendom can be boiled down to two statements. So I think I'm doing better than the Creed, actually.
All right.
How many sentences is the Creed?
We got
7, 8?
Yeah, I think 12. They tried to split it up into 12. Try to say each apostle had a piece in it, but I think really there's only like 7.
Okay, but to me personally, as I've thought about this over the years, to me Christendom comes down to roughly two statements. One, that there is a self-existent and personal origin of all that is, and two, that this being has disclosed itself through the person of Christ. And then everything else that Christians do kind of derives from those statements. It's like, okay, well, if we take those things as true, what are the implications of that?
I think it's a really good starting point. Like, I think if you start there and have those two things, because you're capturing his full deity in that, right?
Right.
And there's other things to be fleshed out, but if that's your starting point, it's a great place to start if you're trying to understand Christianity.
And so then what we have to do, first of all, then, is we have to talk about the existence of God. So what do we mean when we say this? Well, it should be observed that we are not starting out talking about what people might refer to as the God of the Bible. We're not talking about the God of the Bible. We're not talking about Jesus. We're not talking about any of that stuff. We are doing something much more simple. And the proposition that we're going to discuss this evening is there exists a self-existent and personal origin of all that is. So the first of the two statements that I used to summarize Christendom. Now, in light of the conceptual framework that we laid out last time, I should say out which we laid last time, because I don't end my sentences in prepositions. Where does this fall? Is it a fact? Is it a hypothesis? Or is it faith? And so, for me, it falls into the realm of faith. And the reason why is because I don't know how I would test such a statement.
But there are people who believe in God who will say, I have developed a test. I've done that test. It passed. It works for me. So in that case, it might be a hypothesis for someone else.
Well, for them, then, it would simply be a fact because they've already performed the test.
Okay, great.
Yeah. But I guess, well, can you give an example of that?
Well, I would say someone would say, look at the complexity of creation.
Right, okay.
And so that would prove to me that there has to be some type of sentient being outside the universe that created all of this.
Right.
And that's my test, or that's my hypothesis.
Yeah. Well, let's hold that thought, because we will get into that idea when we talk about the teleological argument. So suffice it to say, I don't I mean, look, far be it from me to discourage anyone from believing in God. I personally don't find those kinds of statements to be proofs in my sense of it, but hey, that's just me. Again, like we discussed last time, what is a fact for one person can be a hypothesis for another, can be an article of faith for someone else, because it all depends on whether or not you can generate tests and whether or not you've performed them. That's really what separates those things. But for me personally, the existence of God does fall into the realm of faith. And so what I'd like to do then, and so then you could say, well, okay, if it falls into the realm of faith, what's there to talk about? Because you can't even posit a test, so there's nothing to talk about.
And I would back up too on what I was saying, given with my example. You know, when we're saying that there is a self-existent and personal origin of all that is, things like the personal. You know, you can say, okay, maybe you can look at some aspects of the universe and physics or just the complexity of biology and say there has to be some type of intelligence behind this.
Right.
But that wouldn't necessarily prove some of the other things in your proposition here.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, like I said, I think we can discuss some of that as we talk about the teleological argument, or even the cosmological argument. We'll get to that point. But getting back to what I was saying about, if I'm taking this as an article of faith, then is there really anything to discuss? Because by my own admission, I cannot posit a test for this, so who cares? Well, the answer is, if you go back to the definition of faith, it consists of three parts. It's that which you take as true, for which you cannot posit a test, and on which you act. And so what you can do then, although you cannot posit a test, what you can do with any article of faith, the existence of God being one such case, is you can just say, okay, well, what happens if I affirm it versus what happens if I deny it? And so you got three conditions for faith. There's really nothing to discuss if you can't posit a test. But what you can do is you can say, okay, fine. I can say, well, if God exists, what can I deduce? If God does not exist, what can I deduce? Where God is taken to be, again, the definition here is the self-existent personal origin of all that is. And then what you can do is you can see how what you conclude from that, how that would affect how you act. And then you can say, then you get to choose, right? You get to choose, and you get to choose, well, based on what I conclude from affirming or denying the proposition, this leads to better or worse actions. This leads to a better or worse life.
So we're saying there's, even though we can't, it's an article of faith, there's actual consequences for picking one side or the other.
Right.
And that is not an article of faith. You can say, okay, when you choose this path, we can observe consequences from that.
Correct.
So that's not necessarily an article of faith.
Right. It's correct. It's a deduction. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that holds true for all articles of faith, which is that, if there is no difference in affirming or denying the proposition in terms of action, then it really isn't an article of faith. It's a superfluous proposition is really what it is. And so part of then what we'll be talking about is what are the consequences. And so basically the tack I'm going to take here is basically to say, look, let's deny the proposition and let's see what happens.
Okay, sounds fun.
Yeah. So I guess the first thing to note is that, like we talked about last time with different examples of faith, one of the examples of faith that I gave is that I believe in the existence of other people. And so in a certain sense, then I'm positing the existence of one more, so that's not that great of a stretch. But in fact, I also posit the existence of people I've never even met, and that's what we mean when we use the word prehistoric. because prehistoric literally means, it's before written history, and yet we suppose that people lived back then. And so we do this sort of thing all the time. So all I'm saying is, before even getting to denying the proposition, the point I'm trying to make here is that what we're doing when we're positing the existence of yet another being is not really something outside of our normal course. Okay, so let's get to. I want to cover all the basic arguments in here before really developing the consequences of denying the proposition. So the first line of argumentation that goes along with the existence of God is what's known as the ontological argument. And so this comes from our good friend Anselm. I think this is like 1053 or something like that. It's a little while ago. And Anselm put together this argument in his Proslogion. And what he basically did was he defined God, and this is a relatively, like, on its face, it seems like a relatively innocuous definition. He defines God as a being than which no greater can be conceived. It's like, yeah, okay.
Why do they call it the ontological argument? What is the meaning of the phrase?
So ontology in general is of or related to being.
Gotcha.
And so the argument, therefore, is based on being itself. We're going to describe God's being, and from that we're going to be able to deduce his existence. So it's a proof that's purely logical as opposed to empirical, which is somewhat like you were talking about earlier with, wow, look at the complexity of nature, or something like that. Anselm's claim roughly is, I don't even have to leave the confines of my own mind.
Okay,
And
gotcha.
I can, bring him, and I can demonstrate his existence. And so he defines God a little differently than we have. So we're defining God as a self-existent and personal origin. Anselm defines God as a being than which no greater can be conceived.
And Anselm, was he a Christian theologian? Okay.
Yeah. I think he was a monk, although I'll have to look that up.
Okay, cool.
So Anselm makes that definition, and then he reasons thusly. Yeah, it was Anselm of Canterbury. So he reasons thusly. He says, look. Well, he basically reasons the way I kind of started out by saying, what happens if we negate this statement, okay? So we're going to define God as a being than which none greater can be thought. We are going to say, well, does this being exist or not? Let's suppose that he does not exist. Okay, fine. Well, clearly, to exist is better than to not exist. Would you buy that?
Yes.
Okay. If you buy that, then what you can do is you can add to the property of God existence. And thus you have considered a being greater than which none greater can be thought. So if God is than which none greater can be thought, but does not exist, then you can imagine a greater being, which is God plus existence.
Okay.
But God, by definition, is than which none greater can be thought.
So it seems a little circular to me.
Well, what it is, in my mind, is that I read this and I go, okay, well, Anselm defined God in such a way that existence is baked into his definition. And so the conclusion of God's existence from Anselm is basically... It's basically just showing that he defines God into existence. So if you take Anselm's definition, well, then that being has to exist. But there's no reason you have to take that definition.
So yeah, there's the easy out there.
I think so. So anyway, so that's Anselm's argument. Now, I believe it's Alvin Plantinga, I think, in recent times, and by recent I mean like the 50s or something like that, has written on this and thinks it's quite cogent. And I guess one of the reasons I bring it up is because I think it's the case that philosophers are somewhat split on whether or not this is a worthwhile argument or not, but it's part of antiquity, so I figured we should at least look at it. We should at least mention it. I personally don't find it that convincing, but hey, I've been wrong about all sorts of things. Okay. So then there's the cosmological argument. We'll get to that momentarily because it's bound up. That's actually a longer argument than I think some people give it credit. So we'll go to the teleological argument. So the teleological argument is one that argues from purpose. And that's basically the idea that if you see a watch on a beach, you posit a watchmaker.
Okay.
Right? Now, admittedly, I've sort of tipped the scales in that example because when I say a watch, one of the properties of watches is that they're made by people.
That does make sense. And what is the etymology of the teleological?
Telos is purpose. So
Okay.
it's argument from purpose.
Gotcha.
And so what happens then with the teleological argument is that you wouldn't say watch because then you've already won the argument. So instead what you would say is something like the complexity of the world, of the universe, is so great that any reasonable person would posit a creator. And an example I give of this, instead of a watch, is something far more simple, which is suppose you're walking through the forest. There's a river that cuts through the forest, and you need to get to the other side of it. Serendipitously, a tree has fallen, or no, I can't say a tree has fallen. Serendipitously, there's a tree trunk connecting either side of the riverbank, allowing you to pass over it, okay? Now, if you saw that, you probably would be like, maybe that was someone, or maybe I'm just lucky that there was a storm one night and the tree fell, right? But now suppose you're walking through the forest, there's a river, and there's two tree trunks spanning the river, connecting the banks, and they're perpendicular to the banks and parallel to each other, and right next to each other so that barely any daylight goes through them. Now, if you saw that, would you assume that a person did that, or would you just assume that nature did that?
I would assume it was much more likely that a person did it. I wouldn't rule out nature, but I would definitely assume it was much more likely that there was some intelligent agency behind
Right.
the
Exactly.
placement of the trees.
And that's the thing, is that I don't even have to bother going, well, look at the complexity of the human body and look at the stars and magnetic fields. I don't have to do any of that. I could just look at tree trunks and you can and here's the thing, again, faith is bound up with the idea of action. If you see that, you're going to act like a person was there.
You might trust it more. You're like, well, someone placed these
Right.
for the purpose of crossing the river.
Yep.
So I'm going to, I don't know, be less careful, or what you would say. I would be willing to use.
Yeah, you'd be willing to use it. I think you'd be a bit more confident in it. I think you might look around for other markers, maybe some instructions, maybe a signpost to a nearby city or something like that.
Village or something like that.
Yeah, you would start to go, wait, there's agency here, there's intelligence here. And that's the idea of the teleological argument. And then, of course, then you can take that and you can talk about human biology and go into that and talk about the complexity of that. And that's actually an interesting tack. So let's see here. This was, and guys like, oh, shucks, who's Stephen Meyer?
Yeah.
Signature and the Cell guy, and also guys like David Berlinski, who's not even a Christian. He's a skeptical Jew, I think would probably be but he's like a fun skeptic because he's skeptical of atheists as well as theists. I think he's just a troublemaker, really. But he has fun with it, so I can't really fault him for it. But he makes this point, something that he calls combinatorial inflation. And this actually harkens back to, there was a symposium back in 1966 at the Vister Institute mathematical challenges to the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution. And the idea with this is that they were saying, look, if you look at DNA and you look at everything that goes into it and all of the different combinations that can take place, sifting through all those combinations to come up with all these species that can exist, that do exist, I believe it's the case that the estimates of the life of the universe are roughly, we'll say, cosmological in origin or astrophysical in origin. And his point is that there's just not enough time to sift through all of the different biological combinations of things like DNA and the proteins and all that. Even if you grant the age of the universe that's typically stated from astrophysicists to try out.
Oh, it's way too short. Like
it's
14 billion years is way too short for anything to randomly happen that.
Right. Yeah, right. It's way too short, and so then the probability that this happened is so infinitesimal, it might as well be zero. And so then to assume that evolution itself was able to bring into being all of the complexity that you see before you, you have to realize that nowhere else in your life would you possibly reason that way. That if you have a choice between two options and one has this infinitesimal probability associated to it, nowhere else in your life would you go, yeah, that's the one. There's an automobile in the street. How'd that get there? Well, a tornado hit a junkyard.
Right.
Yeah, maybe.
Well, I always find it interesting. This might go back to the ontological argument that we discussed. The famous clip of Richard Dawkins telling Ben Stein that maybe aliens could have kickstarted life on Earth.
What do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in evolution?
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet. Now, that is a possibility and an intriguing possibility. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
And
yeah, way to push it back there, pal.
Yeah, and you could see how maybe even the ontological argument could have some appeal to someone when they see someone like Richard Dawkins say that, because you'd be like, okay, why are we bothering with aliens? If I just can go as high as I can, that's going to be God, and that's probably who's responsible for this, and I'm going to leave it at that.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, and we'll talk about that more when we do the cosmological argument. Which I suppose we can transition into right now. So okay, so let's do this. The cosmological argument, and this goes back to it probably goes back further than this, to our good friend Aquinas when talking about the unmoved mover. So Aquinas, when he's developing these ideas in the Summa Theologiae, he typically starts out with arguments against the thing for which he's arguing. So he basically puts up the arguments against the proposition and then says, on the contrary, and then responds accordingly and refers to God as the unmoved mover. And what's his name? William Lane Craig often talks about this. He talks about the Kalam cosmological argument. And basically what they assert is that there has to be a beginning, because infinite regress does not make any sense.
Okay. And is there a particular reason, like cosmological is finally a word I understand, but is there a reason we call it the cosmological argument?
I think because it's referring to the cosmos itself, so it's very much an empirically based argument.
So it wouldn't make sense for the matter we see to just have some type of infinite history. That's
roughly
argument.
The idea. Okay. Yeah, is that there had to have been a starting. Basically, there has to have been a starting point it's not the case that something can come from nothing. So there had to be something that exists at the beginning of time whose reason for existence is found within itself. Okay. So I think that's roughly the cosmological argument. You can't have infinite regress. There must have been a beginning. There is something instead of nothing. Something can't come from nothing. Therefore, there must be some self-existent origin. All right. So now we're getting closer to the proposition that we laid out at the beginning of this, which is there exists a self-existent and personal origin of all that is. So now let's start denying the components of it. And let's do the self-existence part first. So what happens when there isn't? Well, what happens when there is not a self-existent first cause, say, is that what that means then is that all that exists or has existed has been caused by something that comes before it, has an antecedent cause. And so what that means is that all that is, you and I, is a link in a series, perhaps in a set of series, because maybe your lineage and my lineage, there's no overlap.
There probably is.
I mean, we talk about a common ancestor, but maybe there isn't. I don't know. Again, it's prehistoric. How should I know? Although we're both as white as the day is long, so they're probably
and
is.
German.
And German. But I repeat myself.
Do you know when your family immigrated to the United States?
Let's see here. It would be.
Was it in the 19th century or was it or before that?
It would be early 20th, late 19th.
Okay.
Yeah, because it was either in both cases it was either I think it was great grandparents coming over from Germany and from Holland.
Gotcha.
Yep. Okay. But anyway, you can imagine perhaps there are multiple series stretching into the infinite past. And so what that means then is all that is a link in a series, perhaps in a set of series of occurrences stretching back into the infinite past, which means that your father begat you, and his father begat him, and his father begat him, and his father begat him, into the infinite past. So this is the idea of infinite regress. Now, guys like William Lane Craig, and I should preface this by saying Craig's a very sharp guy, so I'm in some sense undermining my credibility here, but if you have to choose, I would bet on him, but I still disagree with him on this point. William Lane Craig's a sharp guy. He doesn't care for the idea of infinite regress, but he does little, like if you watch him in his debates or whatever, all he really does is just call it absurd, which is really just ad hominem. And
yeah, it's not kind of real proof or a real, retort, right?
No, right. Yeah. I mean, he just goes, but things just, like, see if I can do my William Lane Craig. But things just stretching into the off. Nah, that's bad. All right. Things just stretching into the infinite past. That's just absurd. That can't possibly happen. And if you read some of his books, again, that's more what it comes off of. It's like he can't conceive of it.
That's interesting because I feel like a lot of the secular physicists and philosophers, that's what they believe. So it's almost like not being on the same page.
Well, that's an interesting point. What is an interesting point is that it's also at odds with the Big Bang, right? You can either have a Big Bang or you can have infinite regress, but you got to choose.
Well, what's also interesting too, like the big secular physicists, they've never liked the Big Bang for that reason. That it was the beginning of the universe, and so like all this kind of some of the weird ideas behind string theory and stuff is like, okay, how can we get the multiverse in here and kind of show that the Big Bang is constantly happening? There's constantly new universes getting poofed into existence when other universes rub up against each other, and how can we keep the idea of an infinite past alive, kind of, so. And Brian Greene specifically, he's always on PBS. He's one of these guys on TV, kind of like Neil deGrasse Tyson. He just did a talk a couple of years ago with Joe Rogan, where he's just trying to explain that.
Brian Greene?
Okay. That we've mathematically proven that that there's another version of you somewhere. Mm-hmm. If you can just go far enough out. And it's like, we've proven this mathematically. There's another version of us sitting here talking to each other somewhere out there. And it's like, it doesn't pass the smell test for someone like me. It just sounds ridiculous.
Not at all.
But they are very adamant on this point. And so this goes back to our conceptual landscape thing. When you have two different sets of ideologies or philosophies that are that far apart, and there's no interaction with them. You got William Lane Craig over here saying that that's absurd, and you got Brian Greene saying, like, I can believe in materialistic evolution because anything's possible, because there's another version of you and me sitting, umpteen sectillion miles away from each other.
Right. Yeah, I guess also getting back to the conceptual landscape, to me, guys like that are those are the guys who mistake the model for reality. The what is it? The map is not the territory, I believe is the phrase, right? The map is not the territory, models aren't reality. I am willing to believe that there is some sort of probabilistic model whose axioms you can articulate, and once stated, you can draw those conclusions. I'm completely willing to believe that. The question is whether or not that probabilistic model is an accurate representation of reality. And Neil deGrasse Tyson, I never really paid attention to him. But whenever I see him in clips, which, again, I need to be fair to the man, I haven't examined his work, but whenever I see him in clips, he's just sort of bloviating almost about, well, it's scientific and it's science and the superiority of this and that, and I'm making these grand sweeping claims. Like, here's one. Like, this is going to be approximately correct, but something like, 95% of space is dark matter.
You just don't understand how to explain gravity yet.
Well,
so, you just make up something to fill in the gaps.
Yeah, exactly. Well, now who's the god of the gaps?
Yeah.
But it's like, dude, you've never even been off of Earth, and you're telling me what's filling space hundreds of light years away? Like, come on, man. I'm willing to believe that there is a physical model whose assumptions you can write down, and from those assumptions you can draw the conclusion that dark matter fills 95% of space. Totally willing to believe that. But again, the map is not the territory, the model is not reality. And so I find those claims interesting. I find them, maybe that has some applicability in some engineering problem that you're trying to solve. I don't know. But for me, I'm not going to base life decisions on a guy with a telescope. You know what I'm saying?
Fair enough.
Well, because that's the definition of faith.
And that goes back to the gap. Like, you just go back to Carl Sagan. What was the show he did back in the 70s?
I don't know. Well, I know what you're talking about, though.
Well, Neil deGrasse Tyson, they did a remake with Seth MacFarlane and Neil deGrasse Tyson a couple years ago.
Seth MacFarlane?
Yeah. They had some animation in there and whatnot.
Okay.
And, oh my gosh, I am totally drawing a blank on the name of this show. The Cosmos.
Oh, okay.
There it is. So Carl Sagan does The Cosmos, and it's I never watched the original, but the Neil deGrasse Tyson version from a couple years ago, Seth MacFarlane, it's just a polemic against religion.
Right.
It's a bunch of made up stories about how religion's bad.
Bruno became an evangelist, spreading the gospel of infinity throughout Europe. He assumed that other lovers of God would naturally embrace this grander and more glorious view of creation.
What a fool I was.
He was excommunicated by the Roman Catholic Church in his homeland, expelled by the Calvinists in Switzerland, and by the Lutherans in Germany.
And it's just kind of embarrassing.
Some claim that evolution is just a theory, as if it were merely an opinion. The theory of evolution, like the theory of gravity, is a scientific fact. Evolution really happened.
But there is a clip in there, which is a classic clip, and we'll have to see if it's on YouTube, where they talk about how they have no idea where life came from.
Nobody knows how life got started.
Maybe someone watching this will be the first to solve the mystery of how life on Earth began.
Does he really say that?
Yes, it's a great. It's like in episode 2 of the show.
Is he like winking into the camera while he does it?
No,
Like,
he's being completely serious. You know, and this is all
They didn't even catch that in
intersplicing
editing?
with like how the church, you know, put Galileo under house arrest and tried to kill science.
Yeah.
You know, before it could blossom and stuff. It's just kind of embarrassing.
Oh heavens! All right, well, good for him. Well, but I guess then the point is both with what is his name, Brian
Greene.
Brian Greene. Okay, on the one side, and William Lane Craig on the other side. Is that in either case, I don't think you really have to even contend with these ideas too much. What the absurdity or the certainty of it, as I hope to demonstrate here. One more point about William Lane Craig, though, is that the idea of infinite regress, and he goes into this, he talks about like Hilbert's Hotel, which is an illustration of, quote unquote, the absurdity that comes with thinking in infinite concepts. David Hilbert was a mathematician in the 1900s, maybe the 1800s too. I can't remember when he was actually born. But what's amusing to me is that Hilbert's Hotel is simply illustrative of ideas related to infinity that any like undergraduate math major reads and goes, yeah, okay. There's nothing absurd about it at all. And William Lane Craig's like, oh my goodness. It's like, buddy, you got to calm down. You got to stay in your lane. I tell William Lane Craig to stay in his lane as I'm going into his lane.
There you go.
That's okay. He'll never hear this. All right, but let's play with the idea of infinite regress for just a moment, and then let's see what comes of it. Well, so again, all that is a link in a series, and a set of series of occurrences stretching back into the infinite past. And so children are beget by parents, so you are beget by your father, who's beget by his father, beget by his father, ad infinitum, all into the, all into negative infinity, all into the great unknown of the past. And so then what can we say then about that? Well, for one, like we said, there is no Big Bang, so that's interesting. Another is that if you think about it, what does this mean then? Well, what it means is that the self-existent thing is the series. The self-existent thing is the regress itself, because that's the thing that always is.
And does that mean that does that mean in that world where if you had sufficient knowledge of the nature, then you could predict where things are going? Like maybe you could find some determinism in that, right? Because if the regression is the self-existence, then you should be able, if you have sufficient knowledge, to know what's going to happen next, or deduce what's going to happen next, maybe?
That is something, that is a conclusion that comes from this in the following way, which is that, so if there is no first being, if you will, if there is no self-existent entity, then the thing that is self-existent is the regress, is the process of going backwards and forwards forever, although there's no guarantee that we'll go forward. As the Doors say, the future is uncertain and the end is always near. But it should be observed then that if the self-existent thing is the series, is the regress, is the process, then although there is something self-existent, it's not a person. There is no personality there. And yet, again, by assumption, by faith, I assume there is innate and there is personality here. So what does that mean? That means you have the
It's an illusion.
Well, perhaps, but you have the impersonal begetting the personal. And again, kind of going back to the idea of the teleological argument, the biological complexity is so complex that even our current estimates of the age of the universe are insufficient to account for the biological complexity. You can make a somewhat similar case here, which is that all of your experience is life begetting life and personality begetting personality. You've never in your life seen personality spring into existence from the impersonal. Your kitchen cabinets have never begun talking to you, for instance. Hopefully. You drink heavily sometimes, so.
Yeah.
No. But you've never experienced that. So again, you have to ask yourself, why is it the case that in this very particular instance, when all of your experience is that personality begets personality, do you now go, you know what? I think that personality just sprang into existence out of the impersonal. That seems highly odd to me, why you would make that assumption.
And we talked about how, the regression itself is the process. If that's true.
Yeah, the regression is the self-existent thing.
Right.
So you can't seem to get away from self-existence. Mm-hmm. But the choice you have to make is there a personality?
Well, I guess what I was going to say is if the regress is the self-existent thing that we're, for lack of a better term, worshiping, if our only observation of it is life begetting life, why would we assume that at some point in the past that life didn't beget life?
Well, exactly. That's the point. Life begets life. Personality begets personality. That's empirical. Why would you make the assumption to the contrary? That's very weird. That's very odd. And so in my mind,
It's absurd.
It's absurd. I'm just saying it's odd. You go, wait a minute, why are you doing that? Why are you making that assumption? So to me, that's what you get to deal with. But wait, there's more. So if you have something impersonal begetting things, which now it could be, so basically you can't get around the problem of self-existence. There's always going to be something self-existent, whether it's a being or a process. Well, now we come to the idea of purpose. If there is no person, then there is no purpose. So, for instance,
Can you expand on that?
Well, let's see. Do I? I guess because
Do you mean that if there's something that's not sentient, then there's no, I guess, purpose. What's another word for purpose?
Well, that's the thing, is that you don't assign volition in the absence of personality. Whenever you say, what's the purpose for this thing? Like, again,
like you wouldn't look at a supernova and be like, oh, there was a purpose behind that event.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like, it's cool, it's powerful, it's awesome, but like there wasn't a purpose behind it. It was just,
When you see a lightning strike, you assume that nature's obeying its laws. Now, admittedly, that's a model. That's part of a conceptual model that we place on things. We assume that nature operates according to fixed laws, and that's part of the.
But you don't fix agency to the thunderstorm.
Correct. Right. I don't, at least. Maybe you do.
Depends on which god you worship.
Right. Yeah.
If
right.
it's Thor, then
Anyway, right. You don't assign agency to a thunderstorm, or when if you were to spill your cup and water falls out of it and runs onto the floor, like, oh, there's meaning in this. This is important.
This means something. This is important.
What's that? There's that movie with Richard Dreyfuss when he's doing that in the mashed potatoes.
Don't recall.
Okay. Let's move on. But anyway, the point is that in the absence of personality, there is no purpose. Now, in the presence of personality, there might also not be a purpose. So, I'm sure there are all sorts of things around your house that just so happen to be there, and it's not like you sat down and really thought it through. You just did it. Yes. No.
All I was gonna say is there's a lot of purpose in this room right now that we're standing in.
Yeah.
We got a Christmas tree, and it's all Whoville.
That's true.
And it's all for a little baby.
Right. But but now think about your basement where you just throw crap.
Oh, that looks like total chaos.
Right. There's no purpose down there. No. There's a personality. There's no purpose.
Yes.
And so, purpose presumes a personality. But if there is no purpose, then one of the fun conclusions is that there is no moral law. And here's what I mean by moral. And I think some people think that that's a bit of a jump. Like, I don't have to believe in God to be a good person. It's like I don't have to believe in God to think that I shouldn't, murder or rape or whatever, all that stuff. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that if there is no person, there is no purpose, and therefore there is no, if you will, ordinate way to conduct yourself in the world.
Well, I think if you say I can be a good person without believing in X, you're presuming a moral law, right?
Yeah, because you're using the word good. Right. You're using the word good, and then the question is, from whence does that come? And so my point is simply that when you refer to good, you're referring to a proper way to act and an improper way to act. Well, from whence comes the idea of proper and improper? Well, those come from the idea of purpose. So again, pull this from metaphysics, and let's just talk about something like driving an automobile. Well, surely there is an ordinate way to drive an automobile and an inordinate way to drive an automobile.
You can drive a car with your feet if you want to. That don't make it a good fucking idea.
And he's right. You can't drive a car with your feet. And it's not a good idea. Why? Because it wasn't designed to do that, right? The purpose of the engineer is reflected in the construction of the car. And you can conduct yourself in accordance with that purpose or against that purpose. Well, okay, all well and good for the car, but what about existence itself? What about life itself? What about you and I? How ought we to conduct ourselves interacting with one another?
So, we could say we're very complex structures, obviously.
You mean people?
Yeah, people
Okay.
are very complex structures.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, if that structure didn't have some type of origin that was purposeful, you could just say that it doesn't matter what you do with your complex structure.
Well,
You
yeah,
know,
because
the
to
other
what are
hand-
you appealing?
Yeah.
There's no purpose. There's no purpose to which you're appealing. When you say you're driving the car like an idiot, you're appealing to the mind of the manufacturer. When you say you shouldn't drive it with your feet. When you grasp a knife by the blade as opposed to the handle, and you say that's a dumb way to grab the knife, you're appealing to the purpose that the manufacturer had in mind for the knife. The knife is meant to be grasped by the handle. If I come into your house and I kick over your Christmas tree, actually, I think I fear your wife more than you at that point.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But I'm acting against the purposes for which you have constructed this room, right? And we would consider all of those acts bad, at the very least relative to the purposes of the creator of the room, of the car, of the knife, right? But what about life itself? What about existence itself? In the absence of a personality, there is no purpose to which you can appeal. There is no way to distinguish between ordinate and inordinate action. There is no way to discern whether or not you are acting in accordance with some purpose or not, because there isn't any.
So good and bad doesn't exist then, if that's
in any
what you're-
absolute sense.
Yeah.
So I think the Christian then, in technical terms, would define what's good as acting in accordance with the purposes for which God created us in the same way. And that sounds abstract, but it's no different than saying driving a car with your hands instead of your feet. Those are the purposes for which the car was created in the mind of the manufacturer. What are the purposes for which you are created?
So the Christian might have a really specific set of boundaries that they put around that question. So let's take someone like a theist, for example, who
Sure.
may believe in a self-existent God who
Yep.
did create everything.
Yep.
Maybe on the personal side of it, they're not necessarily too interested in the personal aspect of God, but they definitely say, okay, I am created with a purpose.
Yeah.
What's wrong with the way I'm choosing to live my life? why do I have to believe in the God that you're proposing?
Well, you just told me they believe in God and that he created.
And that's all we're arguing.
So that's all we're arguing here.
Okay.
So, I mean, they already do.
I just want to clarify that.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important step, like, because it's not a what do you call the number lines? You're the mathematician.
It's true.
Well, no, there's a continuous and a discrete. So
Okay.
we're not dealing in discrete deals where it's like there's the atheist and then there's the Christian.
Oh, right.
You know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, that's why we're taking this very, we'll say, mild definition of God as self-existent and personal, the self-existent and personal origin. We're not saying it's Jesus. So I think that's where it comes in, right? Is that a theist, you can have a theist who says there's a God that created the world and they went on holiday or something like that. They don't really care. They spun it up and then took off. That's fine. But even still, when you say that, you have a being who's acting.
And the theist would, at bare minimum, would have to admit that there are certain ways that we should act and certain ways that we shouldn't act based on the way we were created. Like nature, you talk about nature's law, nature's God, nature's law, that type of deal. Mm-hmm. That's a classic Enlightenment way of describing the theistic God.
Oh, you mean the natural law?
Yeah, natural law, yeah.
Well, yes, but again, I think that when we talk about things like absolute morality, what we're really saying is the purposes in the mind of the creator. Now there isn't a should there or an ought there unless you are saying, do you want to act in accordance with the purposes of the creator? Then you should do this, then you ought to do that. Now a theist might argue and say, well, I disagree. I don't think so. Let's abstinence until marriage. Let's take that one as an example. Yeah, abstinence until marriage. A theist could reasonably say, I don't think that was in the mind of the creator. Okay,
You can say that's observable.
Yeah.
People do that all the time.
Yeah. People do it all the time. It seems like a good time. I have fun when I do it. So I don't really think that was in the mind of the creator. Okay, that's fine. Well, then you can have an argument and say, and you can discuss whether or not abstinence until marriage was in the mind of the creator. But what you are not discussing is whether or not appealing to the mind of the creator is the ontic referent, is the thing that's
Ontic? I've never heard that word.
Again, what would that ontic would be the adjective of ontology.
Oh, gotcha.
Related to being. So the ontic referent is sort of the fixed point to which all other things are referent.
Okay.
Yeah. So you and I might disagree on whether or not abstinence until marriage was in the mind of the creator, but we're both agreeing that we ought to be appealing to the mind of the creator. And so a theist can admittedly depart from traditional Christendom all over the place. And that's what you have, for instance.
Well, that's our disagreement with other religions.
Yeah,
right?
that's the Muslims. That's the
Muslims
Jews.
Not going to argue with the basic
Hindus.
things we're arguing in this episode. You
Right.
know, they're going to be right on board with what we're saying.
Yeah, but what we're going to disagree on is, well, what is in the mind of the creator? And I think that goes to the second of my statements, which is that, and this being has disclosed itself through the person of Christ. You know, that's
which we're not covering.
We are not covering today, but that's where we would derive our ideas about what is in the mind of the creator.
So there's many atheists that have purpose, or they would say that they have purpose in life.
Yeah.
You know, and they live their lives seemingly with purpose, with a drive, with a mission.
Yep.
So how do you so you accuse the atheists and say, you can't believe in purpose.
Yeah.
They say, well, I'm obviously living with purpose.
Yeah.
Where do you, I don't know, I lost the words, but
how
do you, they would say, I live with purpose and there's no reason I can't.
Yeah, that's right. I don't believe in God and I live with purpose.
Yeah.
You're telling me I can't live with purpose, and yet I do, so take a hike, pal.
Right. So, so for the people who would not be receptive to what we're saying in this episode, how would you, I don't know, prove to them that they aren't living with purpose?
Well, I'm not proving to them that they aren't living with purpose, but what I can say is I can talk about, say, what happens.
Not living with purpose, telling them that they can't say they're living with purpose if they believe that there isn't a self-existent creator.
No, I think they are living with purpose. But here's the thing: is that we're using the same word in two different ways. They are living with purpose in that they have purposes and they're acting on them. Everyone has volition, everyone has a value hierarchy. They are acting in accordance with that. What I'm saying is that,
and that's the conceptual landscape.
Yeah. But what is not the case is that they are not acting in accordance with the purpose. If there's a God, they're not necessarily acting in accordance with the purposes for which they were created. Or, in the absence of a God, there is no purpose for which they are created. They are simply generating these purposes in and of themselves. And you could say that's fine.
Would you say their purposes are an illusion?
No. Well, see, okay, so that's another thing, which is that if we are to take, so I guess we'll come back to that point, but if we are to take the idea of a lack of personality seriously, if there is no purpose and nature is all that is, and we have this idea that nature operates according to fixed rules which may be discovered through investigation and logic, well, then you find yourself in this somewhat uncomfortable position in the sense that, sans anthropomorphism, no one has ever assigned meaning to things like chemical reactions, or you said the electrical storm, right? Or rock slides, or water falling off of the table. But
anthropomorphism is just humans acting, right?
No, anthropomorphism is when you assign human intelligence or volition to non-human. So like when you complain about your car, it's like, yeah, she's acting up today.
Got it.
Or I'll often say that my computer's acting like a brat. The computer's not doing anything. It's just operating according to the laws of physics, as we understand it at least. There's no person there. But that's how we talk about it. But what I'm saying is, although we might speak that way sometimes, and frankly I think it's a fun way to speak, the point is that you have all these physical processes. You do not assign any sort of meaning to it. You do not assign any purpose to it. But then you have to ask yourself, if we are purely material, if we are just part of this infinite regress of nothing but physical matter, how are we any different from water spilling, from rocks falling, from electrical storms? How are the utterances of my mouth right now any different than the sound of water boiling?
Yeah, I guess we were just much more complex chemical reactions
We're just
and combinations.
very complex chemical reactions. But then what that means is that Nate is no different from a babbling brook. And yet, so now I have this problem, right? Which is that I already said I assume on faith I accept the existence of other personalities, but I can't do that if it's just this purely materialistic infinite regress. I can't do that because there is no Nate, there is no I, and there is no thou, and the utterances of your loved ones possess the level of meaning of the sound of a crackling fire. And so
that is depressing.
And so again, this is the point about the tack we're taking here, which is that you can negate the existence of God all you want, but the conclusions which are coming from it start to become somewhat untenable.
They just are hopeless. And I think we've talked about this before. I don't know if we've done it yet on this show, but just the idea of, if you want to tear down something, you got to replace it. So philosophically, if you want to tear down God, if you want to say he doesn't exist, you have to replace him with something, and they don't have anything to replace God with. And it just leads to despair.
I think that's where it ultimately leads when you think about it long enough. Now, again, it's not going to be true for everyone. Although, you never get to know a person's innermost thoughts, and I'm not going to assume anything about guys like Dawkins, for instance. I don't know. I'm not going to pontificate on what he thinks or feels or any of that stuff. But I think at the very least, you find yourself in this uncomfortable position of pure materialism means the absence of I. It means the absence of thou. It means there is no overarching purpose to which you might appeal in the same way that you might appeal to a manufacturer. There's no reason to believe that there is any structure to the world. So again, just like with the trees across the pond, not the pond, the river, the brook, or with the automobile, or with the computer, or whatever, when you see those things, you go, a man made this, a mind, this is the product of a mind. It starts in the mind and then moves to action. And so you look for patterns, you look for structure, you believe something like that's there. And so you do that interacting with people. But existence itself, you can't appeal to anything. The knowledge that something is created versus existing implies a deal of scrutability. If something is created, you believe it's scrutable, that it's explainable, that there's a reason why things act the way they do. But in the absence of a creator, you don't get to have that. It's just happenstance. And I haven't even been able to fully articulate this because I don't even think my mind can think that way in a certain sense that there is no science because the patterns that we observe, the evolutionists would say something like, we survived. So, I mean, everything's reduced to survival of the fittest, right? We survive because we're able to observe patterns which allow us to survive. And if we didn't observe those patterns, then we would have died. And so all the people that didn't observe the patterns died, right? That's roughly the kind of story that an evolutionist would tell, evolutionary biologist would tell. But even using the word pattern, how do you even know it's a pattern? Maybe it's just like especially when you're talking about the universe being around for 1 billion years or something like that, maybe it's only been a pattern for 10,000 years, then it's going to go away, just to be replaced with random noise. You don't know. And there's no reason to believe that it won't be. There's no reason to believe that gravity won't change tomorrow.
It's also very interesting how assured of themselves that they are when they, take the formulas and say, in whatever it is, 10 billion years, all the stars are going to blink out.
Right.
In 100 billion years, all the atoms are just going to start to decay or, whatever the number is.
Right, yeah.
And it's like, it goes back to what you were saying earlier about how the map, not the territory. It's like the hope and the assurance that they put in their models kind of disconnects them from reality in a way that, it takes time to get there, but once you're there, it's like, how did I get here? To the point where I'm doing this to myself.
Where are you doing what to yourself?
Just putting the models that you've developed for yourself and making that your lens through you see reality when it really has nothing to do with reality to a certain extent.
Well, but you have to use models because of the complexity of reality.
Sure.
But I think it's a mistake to one, again, assume that you're correct. If you were omniscient, you would know it by definition. Anselm and I can agree on that. So yeah, if you to assume that your model is completely sufficient, I think I don't think that's the best idea. But and also again, I think it's because of the definition of faith incorporates the idea of action. The idea of basing the actions I take on a guy with a telescope, or a guy with a test tube who changes his estimates every so many years, that also doesn't seem like a good idea in my mind, to let their empirical observations and the consequences of their models, which they are continuously updating, govern the way I live my life.
So we spent a lot of time in this episode talking about the negative consequences of denying the self-existent God.
Oh wait, there's more. Sorry, okay. Were you going to say what are the positives?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Well, I guess.
We can dwell on the negative.
Yeah. I want to dwell on the negatives just for a little bit more, and then we'll talk about that. And so let's just keep going on the absence of a purposeful actor. So, reality was not designed with any purpose in mind, and in particular, you were not designed with any purpose in life. There is no purpose in mind because there was no mind to begin with. There is no ultimate purpose for your life. You are running out the clock until you die. And there is no moral law. And this is what I find interesting about this, is that you have these prohibitions against murder, theft, rape, deceit, slavery. But really, in the absence of a moral law to which you can appeal, these are just matters of taste. It's that, I just don't care for slavery. I like theft every now and then. Slavery's not my thing. Rape's not my thing. Murder, maybe once a year. I can go for a murder. That's about it. All you're really saying with your prohibitions are that you don't like these things. But you can't appeal to the creator of men to say, well, really, these things are against the purposes for which he created us. And so there is no moral law. And so what that means is, not only is there, and I think this then goes to the point that you were talking about, like with a guy like Dawkins, who goes, yeah, I don't care if you say there's no ultimate purpose. I'm acting and I'm having a good time. I get to work at, where is he? Oxford, I think. I get to do
or Cambridge, wherever one.
I get to have my fun at Oxford or Cambridge, and I really don't care. It's like, okay, fine, all well and good, but here's the bigger thing: if there is, in particular, no purpose for you and I, then there's also no purpose for how you and I interact with each other. And to me, that's the big thing. That's when you're talking about things like theft and murder and rape and slavery and all that, all of those things involve at least two players, right? And so there's no ordinate way for you and I, there's nothing to which we can appeal and go, there is some purpose for which you and I were created, and there is a purpose for how we interact with one another. There's a correct way to interact with each other, and there's an incorrect way. And by correct, I mean the purposes for which the interaction was created. And so there is no unifying, overarching ideal toward which we ought to be striving. And that's the thing, is that when there's times of warfare, right, and people are calling for peace, it's like, well, why? Why not?
Why pine for Ukraine?
Yeah. Why do you care about Gaza? Why do you care about Israel? Why do you care about Russia? Why do you care about Ukraine?
Why do you keep saying from the river to the sea?
Why do you care about slavery? Why do you care? Why not just survival of the fittest? Why not? I have the things in which I'm interested. You have the things in which you're interested. You come, our paths are antithetical to one another.
We'll just let conservation momentum solve this problem.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Fortunately, I'm, a fairly large guy, so for the most part it works out. But, here's the thing. There's nothing to which you can appeal. And so in my mind, this comes to the idea of, in mathematics, you have these things called existence theorems. And an existence theorem is a theorem that basically says a certain thing exists. And so you took calculus. You probably know this one. There's something called the intermediate value theorem, and all it says is, how when you draw a continuous line, if it goes up, say, maybe it starts at -1 and then it goes to 1. It's a continuous line. Then it hits every point in between.
Yeah.
Okay. That's the intermediate value theorem, and that's an existence theorem. It says that if there's some value between -1 and 1, somewhere in the interval, the function's going to cross it. It's an existence theorem. It doesn't tell you where. It doesn't tell you how many times. It just says it happens. Mm-hmm. God's existence is an existence theorem that there is a proper way for you and I to interact with one another. And it gives us a reason to look for that, to hope for it. In the absence of God, there is no hope that there is a proper way for you and I to interact. And so in my mind, the best quote on this comes from, I think it's chapter 13 of Hobbes's Leviathan. Now, in Hobbes's Leviathan, what he's trying to do is he's trying to establish the need for what he would refer to as a magistrate in a commonwealth. And so what he does is he posits roughly what I'm saying. And he
Hobbes
says,
was English?
I think so. And he writes, "Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war.
So they're saying that unless they have a common power that they have fear of,
Yes.
then they will be in a condition of war. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And such a war as is of every man against every man, in such condition there is no place for industry. Why? Because the fruit thereof is uncertain. Because you might just come down and steal it, which is why you don't build factories in North Korea. I've got a factory. Oh, it's the people's factory. Oh, well, I'll be going now. The fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, because why would you bother? There's no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, nor commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear. Why? Because you might come and knock me out and take my stuff at any time, and danger of violent death in the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So Hobbes takes this idea and argues for, and because of this, that's why we have to have, basically that's why we have to have the law. I'm the law. That's why we have to have the magistrate.
And the government.
Yeah, that's
which
why
you don't even believe in.
Correct. Yeah, I disagree with Hobbes, because I think really what Hobbes is showing is there needs to be, I mean, we could talk about the practical outworking of this, but in my mind, what needs to be the case is that you have to at least believe that there is a proper way to act toward one another, such that we don't find ourselves in the condition which is called war, as Hobbes puts it. But in order to believe that there is a way to act in accordance with each other, you have to believe that there is a purpose to begin with. Otherwise, there is no reason to hope for peaceful coexistence.
And you have to believe that we have personality, right? You have to believe that we are sentient, that we're not just, an expression of materialistic chemical reaction.
Right. And so, in summary then, if you deny the proposition that there is a self-existent and personal origin, here's what you get. You get no hope of understanding the universe. You either have to treat people like they're objects, because they are objects, which I keep being told I'm not supposed to do. And yet, in a materialistic framework, that's all you are. So why not treat you like an object? So you either get to treat people like objects, or what you have is you have an origin of personality which is at odds with all of your lived experience. That personality begets personality.
Well, if I choose that, am I still allowed to pretend that you're not an object?
Yes, you do get to pretend that in that case, because then there is personality. But now you're going against all of your lived experience. You're making an assumption that violates all of your empirical data to date. Which again,
if that has the same outcome as someone who's religious, does it matter?
Yeah. Well, in that particular case, but wait, there's more. This is just the summary at this point.
Okay.
There's no purpose. There's no moral law. There's no reason for hope for peaceful coexistence with other personalities, and perhaps there's no Big Bang and an uncertain future. So that's what you get when you deny the existence of God. And basically, if you affirm the existence of God, then you get those things. Then you get an origin of that which is coherent with your experience. That personality begets personality. That life begets life. That there is a purpose. That you have a purpose. That there is a proper way for you and I to interact with one another, and that we do have to treat each other with dignity, because we are not mere objects. And so I think to kind of close this out, how does this impact action? Well, in my mind, the reason why I care about this is, for one, I want people to have coherent thought. Just as a matter of course, I think if a person denies the existence of God, really what they're doing is they're living in a state of cognitive dissonance, because at least everyone I've met, they want to believe that there's purpose. They want to act like there's purpose. It's really, have you ever met someone and they say, it feels like my life has no purpose?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I think everyone's felt that at some point in time, and I've certainly met people who have said things like that. Well, right there, it does them no good if Dawkins comes along and says, just make your own purposes, create your own values. But there's, at the very least, again, this is the importance of an existence theorem. In the absence of an existence theorem, you don't even bother looking for something. So just like sort of the flip side of existence theorems in math are what are known as impossibility theorems, where you prove that something can't possibly happen. And so that was, for instance, Fermat's last theorem. Are you familiar with that?
No.
Okay, so Fermat's last, so you know the Pythagorean theorem.
Yeah.
Okay. A squared plus B squared equals C squared, where C is the hypotenuse of a right triangle.
Mm-hmm.
A and B are the lengths of the other sides. Okay, well, a reasonable question might be, okay, and so the classic example is a 3, 4, 5 triangle. That's what carpenters use to make sure they got right angles. Okay, so maybe you would say, well, is it ever the case that I can find integers such that a cubed plus b cubed equals c cubed? Does that ever happen? And the answer is no, and that's Fermat's last theorem, is that if you raise the exponent to 3, 4, 5, and so on, there are no integer solutions to that problem.
So there is no, and I've never thought of this before. So a squared b plus b squared equals c squared. There's no other exponential that works with.
There's no other exponent. Yeah. So like, yeah, if you replace it with a to the 17th plus b to the 17th equals c to the 17th, if you're looking for integer solutions, obviously there's real number solutions to that. But if you're looking for integer solutions, there aren't any.
How did he prove that? Because there's an infinite number of integers that you could test that with.
Yeah, it took him a really long time. No, I mean, it did take him a long time. Let's see here.
Like, how long is a proof like that?
Quite long. Oh, man. Let's see if I can remember this. I think it had to do with proving the modularity of elliptic curves, and I think it was a subset of algebraic geometry, and that's about as far as I've probably already embarrassed myself at this point.
It's interesting. I mean, I'm the engineer,
yeah,
and Ian's the theoretical math guy. And the theoretical math, the stuff that we bother to figure out with theoretical math blows my mind sometimes.
Well, it's one of those things, guys. They wanted to solve it, and they just kept trying. But the point is that in the presence of an impossibility theorem, after Weyl's result, you would not bother looking, right? Because you say it's an impossibility theorem. Similarly, with an existence theorem, you would go looking for a solution. And my point is that with God's existence, you at the very least, you know that a purpose exists, even if you are feeling like your life is meaningless, that there is no purpose for you. It's not true. There is a purpose. You might not know it, but at least it makes sense to look for it. In the absence of a creator, it doesn't even make sense. And nihilism, I think, really is the logical outworking of it. I think nihilism is a logical outworking of denying God's existence. Okay. So yeah, I'm concerned that people have coherent thought. I'm concerned that they will. Another reason why I might care about another reason I might care about whether or not a person believes in God is I'm concerned they might affirm an atheistic philosophy in their actions. So
and we talk about faith. If atheism is faith, the atheist would never say it is, but if it's faith, in our definition, that means you take action on it.
Right.
And not believing in God and taking action on that belief is something we're scared of. You probably have a lot of atheists out there who say they don't believe in God, but if they're living with purpose, they are living as if God exists. But what happens when it gets tough?
Right, that's the thing.
What happens when it's time to flip the switch?
Right, that's the thing, is that one of the things that I say is that everyone's a friend on a Saturday night, right? Saturday night, we're all having fun, have a few drinks, good music. Everyone's a friend. No. Your friends are the ones that help you move. Your friends are the ones that come and pick you up when your car breaks down. Those are the friends. And so that's one thing in my mind, is that if a person really is an affirmed atheist, I am confident that if they think lying is going to get them what they want, they're going to do it.
Yeah, I wouldn't. This is going to sound incredibly prejudiced of me, and it is. I would not trust someone who said they're an avowed atheist.
No, me neither. Well, I would trust them less because trust is on a continuum.
Okay, sure, fine.
But
I would not put a lot of stock into that person and what they said.
Yeah, at least not initially.
Even if I liked them as a person, even if maybe I knew them my whole life, maybe they're a childhood friend and we grew up together or whatever, there'd be some level of distrust that'd be baked in that relationship just off of that fact.
Yes, absolutely. Now, someone might retort, but what about all the bad things that Christians do? Yes, I recognize that. Yeah, I recognize that.
We're Protestants. We're allowed to say that.
That's right. But I guess I'm making a statement about averages here,
and the averages say that the Christians are better.
In everything.
At everything.
We're smarter, we're better looking. I mean, it's clear. And so then I guess the final point is, let's take the person who says they're an atheist, but really does live as if God exists. Then why not just affirm it? What is preventing you from just saying that he exists? You act like there's purpose in the universe. You act like there's an ordinate way to live. You act like there's an ordinate way to interact with other people. Why not just affirm it? What is preventing you from affirming it? And just like with the other statement, I'm somewhat suspicious that the reason you're not affirming it is because there's somewhere in your life, there's some area of activity where you want an out. And just like with Huxley, I think it was Huxley, who said, I didn't want there to be a God. This is Huxley coming from Ends and Means. He writes, I had motives for not wanting the world to have meaning and consequently assumed it had none. And was able without any difficulty to find satisfying reasons for this assumption. So he's just coming right out. He goes, I started with the goal in mind, and I looked for reasons. And he says, the philosopher who finds no meaning in the world is not concerned exclusively with the problem of pure metaphysics. He is also concerned to prove that there is no valid reason why he personally should not do as he wants. For myself, as no doubt for most of my friends, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation from a certain system of morality. We objected to the morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom. The supporters of the system claimed that it embodied the meaning, the Christian meaning they insisted in the world. There was one admirably simple method of confuting these people and justifying ourselves in our erotic revolt. We would deny that the world had any meaning whatsoever.
I really appreciate the honesty.
I do too. I'm like, I love it. It's like, Huxley, I get it, man. You wanted to go out and have a lot of sex. I can understand that. I'm sorry that you had to saw off the philosophical branch in which you were sitting. Man, I hope it was worth it. And so that's kind of the third point about it. So you might say, why do I care about this? It's like, well, look, like we said, faith, the definition of faith is inherently tied up in action. And if there are people who affirm atheism, if there are people who say, look, man, I live as if God exists, but they're not willing to affirm it, I'm just suspicious. I'm just like, well, what are you up to? You're up to something. I don't know what it is, but you're up to something.
Just could you give us a quick elevator pitch for how believing in God has just enhanced your life positively?
Well, I mean, it's so pervasive. I think it would be difficult. It's difficult for me to imagine life in the absence of it. I think. Well, yeah, okay. I can give you an example, which is that there have been times in my life when things don't work, right? So, like, for instance, I think everyone in their life, from day-to-day experiences, minor disappointments here and there, right? Every now and then you get a major disappointment. Okay. But sometimes you get major things happening all at once. And so I can give you an example. There was within a few months or something like that, it was like nothing was working vocationally. Nothing was working romantically. Things were bad at church. And my body betrayed me. That's four things.
Yeah.
And they're
The
kind
quattro.
of, and they're kind of big things. It's like my body, my relationships, my church, and my vocation. I mean, that's most of your life right there.
I think that's an understatement almost. That's basically the whole shebang.
Yeah, that's most of your life. And I really did wrestle with the idea of like, man, it just feels like my life is meaningless. Like I tried real hard at work. It didn't matter. I tried hard with this girl. It didn't matter. I tried to keep myself healthy. It didn't matter. Things are going, I worked hard to try to do, good things at church. It's just, there's no support there. What's the point? What's the use? And, in a certain, quote, logical, unquote, I don't really think it is logical. I think it would make complete sense to go, you know what? There isn't one. Booze, cocaine, and hookers, something like that. And some might say, wow, that sounds pretty awesome. But it's a terrible long-term solution. But if you actually believe that, no, even when things are down, there is a purpose. It helps. It helps pick you up. I think a great example is read so many of the Psalms. How many of the Psalms are
him bitching? Right.
Just surrounded by enemies. Everything's going poorly. My friends have betrayed me. But God, I know you're good. Now imagine all of that without the final refrain. That's all you have. That's all you have. Nothing's working, and you have nothing. Why even bother? And so, to me, that's really the time that when you have to cling to it, which is that even when you can't see it, the purpose still exists.
Very cool. Well, Ian, I think this has been a great episode, and I guess who am I to judge? I'm a co-host of this show, but
we're both co-hosts. We're equal, but some hosts are more equal than others.
Well, we'll look forward to next time, and
next time I think you're leading the talk on the historical Jesus.
Absolutely, it'll be a great one.
It'll be a great one, he says.
But until then,
I've read my notes; they're awesome.
Petra will see you out.
This has been another episode of the Steel Creed Show on Earth as it is in heaven.